There is a single fatal flaw in the meticulously crafted illusion of the Brown family's perfect plural marriage, and her name is Truly. For years, viewers watched a masterclass in psychological manipulation unfold on their screens, orchestrated by a woman who weaponized maternal anxiety to conquer a dynasty. Robyn Brown sat on countless couches, tears welling in her eyes, aggressively defending her absolute monopoly over Kody's time by hiding behind a singular, impenetrable shield, the concept of the tender-aged child. She insisted, with absolute conviction, that her youngest offspring simply could not survive more than 48 hours without their father's physical presence. It was the ultimate trump card, a seemingly unassailable defense mechanism designed to lock the gates of the Flagstaff mansion and keep the rest of the family freezing in the cold. But this entire fortress of isolation was built on a breathtakingly arrogant lie. A self-own so blatantly ironic that it has now become Robyn's absolute worst nightmare. Because while Kody was barricaded inside, coddling Solomon and Ariella under the guise of pandemic survival, Truly, who was essentially the exact same age, was entirely abandoned, left to wonder why she was somehow excluded from the tender age protection program. Before we tear down the walls of this sprawling deception and expose the chilling reality of Robyn's calculated favoritism, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to Jenny Exposes. We are diving deep into the darkest, most carefully hidden secrets of reality television's most notorious families, bringing you the unvarnished truth that the networks don't want you to see. So subscribe right now and ring the bell so you never miss a revelation. The phrase tender age wasn't just a passing comment. It was a psychological weapon, a meticulously deployed piece of vocabulary designed to establish an absolute hierarchy of human need. Imagine the suffocating atmosphere inside that million-dollar Flagstaff estate, the windows locked, the doors bolted, the air thick with manufactured paranoia. Robyn positioned herself as the ultimate protective matriarch, fiercely guarding her brood against an invisible threat. But the true threat she was guarding against wasn't a virus at all. It was the rest of the family. By convincing Kody that Solomon and Ariella possessed a unique, almost crystalline fragility, she effectively rewrote the biological reality of the Brown family tree. Truly was a child of the exact same generation, sharing the same developmental milestones, possessing the very same emotional requirement for a father's presence. Yet, in the warped reality of Kody and Robyn's pandemic bunker, Truly was treated as an entirely different species, a resilient outsider who somehow didn't require the same paternal oxygen to survive. It is a stunning display of cognitive dissonance to watch Kody pacing the floors of Robyn's home, declaring his absolute inability to be away from his youngest children for even 2 days, while simultaneously allowing months to bleed into one another without laying eyes on Truly. He didn't know her interests. He didn't know her struggles. He barely even knew what grade she was entering. This wasn't merely neglect, it was an active, coordinated conspiracy of erasure. Robyn's insistence that her children were exceptionally delicate provided Kody with the ultimate permission slip to abandon his other obligations, wrapping his profound failures as a father in the noble cloak of paternal duty. The sheer audacity of this double standard is staggering, a blatant rewriting of family history where only the children residing under Robyn's roof were granted the status of emotional vulnerability. But lies of this magnitude possess an inherent instability. They require absolute silence from the victims to survive, and Truly is no longer silent. The trap has officially snapped shut, and the bait was time itself. The tender-aged children are no longer trapped in the amber of those early pandemic seasons. They have grown, and more terrifyingly for Robyn, they have been granted access to the internet. Truly is now a wildly sharp, fiercely independent, internet-literate teenager who has watched her own family's dysfunction broadcast to the entire world. She isn't the quiet, compliant child who can be shuffled into the background of a chaotic family gathering anymore. She is a highly observant young woman, armed with a smartphone and an intimate understanding of the devastating double standards she was forced to endure. The moment she, or her fiercely protective older siblings, begin dropping even the most subtle digital breadcrumbs, Robyn's carefully curated image as the empathetic, protective mother completely implodes. A single TikTok referencing the absurdity of the 48-hour rule, a perfectly timed eye roll in an Instagram story, a casual mention of the years she spent practically fatherless while living just miles away. These are the weapons of modern exposure, and they are currently aimed directly at the Flagstaff mansion. Robyn must look at her phone with absolute dread, knowing that a single post from Truly could instantly dismantle the defensive narrative that took years to build. The younger generation of Browns are digital natives who communicate in a language of irony and exposure that Kody and Robyn fundamentally do not understand. They cannot control the narrative anymore because the victims of their narrative now hold the microphones. Truly's very existence as an articulate, observant teenager is a walking contradiction to every excuse Robyn ever fed to Kody. When Truly speaks even casually about her childhood, the glaring void where her father should have been becomes impossible to ignore, completely shattering the illusion that Kody's absence was a tragic necessity born of pandemic safety. This presents Robyn with an impossible credibility dilemma, a psychological double bind from which there is absolutely no legal or public relations escape. She is trapped in a prison of her own making, forced to choose between two equally devastating admissions. On one hand, she could finally confess the dark, unspoken truth that she intentionally manipulated Kody's paralyzing fear of the pandemic, weaponizing his hypochondria to effectively ice out the rest of the family and secure a monogamous existence under the guise of safety protocols. To admit this would be to confess to a level of Machiavellian cruelty that would instantly brand her as one of the most calculated villains in the history of reality television. It would validate every suspicion Christine, Janelle, and Mary ever harbored, and it would permanently alienate whatever fractured audience she has left. On the other hand, her only alternative is to double down, to stare directly into the camera and insist, against all logic and biological reality, that Solomon and Ariella are inherently, structurally, more fragile than Truly. She must perpetuate the absolute delusion that her biological children possess a rare, debilitating condition that requires constant, uninterrupted paternal surveillance, while Christine's daughter is somehow miraculously immune to the psychological damage of paternal abandonment. It is a staggering insult to the intelligence of the viewing public. We have all seen the footage. We have watched the relentless juxtaposition of Kody refusing to leave Robyn's driveway, terrified of breaking the arbitrary rules that governed his newfound monogamy, cut against the devastating reality of him openly admitting he hadn't seen Truly in months. The camera does not lie, but Robyn's silence speaks volumes. She is cornered by the archival footage of her own life. The narrative corner she painted herself into was entirely dependent on the children remaining frozen in time, eternally young and mute, unable to challenge the bizarre mythology of their own family dynamics. But time is the ultimate enemy of a liar, and as Truly blossoms into a confident young woman, Robyn's explanations curdle into obvious, pathetic falsehoods. The stakes here extend far beyond bruised egos and family squabbles. We are looking at the precipice of total financial and professional collapse. The tender-aged excuse was not just a convenient fib, it was the absolute linchpin of Kody and Robyn's defense strategy for the last 4 seasons of their television tenure. It was the sole structural support beam holding up the crumbling facade of their plural marriage. Every delayed visit, every canceled holiday, every missed birthday was justified by this singular, fragile concept. Now, pull that pin out, and the entire structure detonates. Without the excuse of protecting the vulnerable little ones, their entire justification for destroying a family of 18 falls completely apart. It reveals the pandemic not as a tragic wedge that forced impossible choices upon a loving father, but as a highly convenient excuse for a man who simply wanted to shed the responsibilities he no longer found appealing. This level of exposure doesn't just alienate viewers, it actively infuriates them. The audience has invested over a decade of emotional energy into the Brown family, rooting for their unconventional structure to succeed against the odds. To realize that the final, fatal blow was struck not by external prejudice or insurmountable logistical challenges, but by an internal, calculated campaign of favoritism, is a betrayal that viewers will not forgive. And the network executives at TLC are paying close attention. Reality television thrives on drama, but it requires at least a baseline of authenticity or relatable vulnerability to maintain its grip on the cultural zeitgeist. When a star transitions from a flawed participant to a purely cynical manipulator, the audience tunes out. Kody and Robyn are staring down the barrel of irrelevancy, risking the very television contracts that fund their lavish, isolated lifestyle. If the central conflict of the show is revealed to be nothing more than a manufactured lie designed to cover up profound neglect, the network has no story left to tell, leaving Kody and Robyn stranded in a sprawling, heavily mortgaged mansion with no income and no family left to film. Let us analyze the sheer audacity of the concrete examples that have been permanently burned into the digital archives of this family's history. Roll the tape in your mind. Picture the intense, unyielding posture Kody adopted when discussing his boundaries. He looked into the lens and declared, with the gravity of a military commander, that he could not possibly be away from Solomon for 48 hours. He painted a picture of a child so deeply dependent, so emotionally tethered to his presence, that a 2-day absence would be catastrophic. And then, in the very same breath, in the very same season, we witnessed the chilling, off-handed admission that he had essentially lost track of Truly's existence. He didn't know her daily routines, he didn't know her passions, and he seemed entirely unbothered by the vast, empty months stretching between their brief, awkward interactions. It is a knockout blow to any lingering defense of his character. This juxtaposition is not merely a failure of time management. It is a profound behavioral flaw, a dark character study in how Robyn's covert manipulation masqueraded as maternal anxiety for years. She perfected the art of using her own children as emotional human shields, positioning them as desperately needy victims to secure absolute, undivided loyalty from a man who was all too eager to abandon his sprawling responsibilities. Robyn operates with a terrifying indifference to the psychological wreckage she leaves in her wake. The damage inflicted on the older children, the deep, lasting wounds of feeling replaced and discarded, are entirely invisible to her, completely obscured by her relentless pursuit of a monogamous reality hidden within a plural framework. She secured the husband, she secured the property, she secured the legal marriage, and she used the manufactured fragility of her children as the ultimate weapon of acquisition. Consider the deeply uncomfortable, entirely inauthentic emotional appeals that became Robyn's trademark. We all remember the infamous scene, the orchestrated fake crying on the outdoor couch, where she dramatically dabbed at dry eyes and lamented to the heavens that she just wanted to sit on a porch with her sister wives, growing old together while their children played. It was a stunning performance, a desperate bid for audience sympathy that completely ignored the physical reality of her own actions. While she cried for a hypothetical porch, she was actively barricading the doors of her actual home. She was drafting a multi-page manifesto of draconian COVID protocols that served no purpose other than to guarantee the absolute segregation of her immediate household from the rest of the family. The hypocrisy is staggering. Claiming to be the ultimate advocate for a united plural family, positioning herself as the great unifier, the empathetic peacemaker, while systematically severing the bonds between her children and the youngest original Brown sibling. Truly was right there, just across town, a vibrant, creative child entirely eager for connection, completely sidelined by a woman who loudly preached the gospel of plural family unity while practicing absolute isolationism. The thematic hypocrisy at the core of Robyn's existence is a moral failing so vast it consumes everything around it. She entered this family asking for acceptance, demanding that her children from a previous marriage be immediately integrated and treated with the exact same love and devotion as the biological Brown children. The family rallied, Kody adopted them, and the entire structure bent to accommodate her needs. Yet, when the power dynamic shifted, when Robyn secured her position as the legal wife and the ultimate arbiter of Kody's time, she did not extend that same grace to the children who predated her arrival. She became the gatekeeper, using the pandemic not as a shield to protect the family, but as a scalpel to excise the members she found inconvenient. And now, the reality check has arrived with devastating force. The older Brown children, the massive, chaotic, loving army of siblings that once defined this family, have completely rallied around Truly. They see the injustice, they recognize the glaring double standards, and they have formed an impenetrable wall of support around their younger sister. This leaves Robyn in a state of terrifying isolation. She won the battle for Kody's undivided attention, but in doing so, she completely lost the war. Her children are now the ones who are totally isolated, trapped within the quiet, sterile confines of the Flagstaff mansion, cut off from the vibrant, joyful, sprawling extended family that makes the Brown clan who they are. They are strangers to their own siblings, victims of their mother's relentless drive for control. We have reached the point of no return. The bridge is burned and the ashes have scattered in the Flagstaff wind. Truly is publicly thriving, blossoming into a brilliant, funny, independent young woman who requires neither Kody's permission nor Robyn's approval to shine. The family divide is no longer a temporary consequence of pandemic paranoia. It is a permanent structural reality. The lines have been drawn, the sides have been chosen, and Robyn is left standing in the ruins of the plural dream she claims to have wanted. She is forced to look around her empty kingdom and realize the horrifying truth. She won the man, but she destroyed the family, and the very child she tried to erase has become the undeniable proof of her ultimate failure. To truly understand the depth of this betrayal, you must step inside the psychological architecture of the Flagstaff mansion, a sprawling, heavily mortgaged fortress that stands as a monument to Robyn's absolute control and Kody's colossal failures. Picture the suffocating silence of those labyrinthine hallways, heavily decorated with expensive, meaningless art and towering displays of hoarded collectibles, a physical manifestation of a family desperately trying to fill the emotional void with material excess. This is the gilded cage, where the myth of the tender-aged child was incubated, a sterile environment completely devoid of the chaotic, organic joy that once defined the Brown family. Inside this bunker, Robyn cultivated an atmosphere of perpetual crisis, a localized state of emergency where every cough, every sniffle, every minor inconvenience was amplified into an existential threat, requiring Kody's immediate, undivided, and aggressive attention. He paced those hardwood floors with the frantic energy of a trapped animal, convinced by the whispers in his ear that he was the sole protector of an impossibly fragile brood. But gaze out the heavy, curtained windows of that very same mansion, past the barricaded driveway and the property line, and you will find the glaring, biological absurdity of their entire foundational lie. Just miles away, in the same mountain air, under the same pandemic sky, lived Truly. She possessed the exact same genetic makeup, the exact same developmental vulnerabilities, and the exact same inherent need for a father's protective shadow. Yet in the warped, draconian calculus of Robyn's pandemic manifesto, Truly was entirely invisible, a ghost haunting the perimeter of a kingdom she was forbidden to enter. The weaponization of the term tender age was not merely a convenient excuse. It was a masterpiece of cognitive dissonance that required Kody to actively suppress his own memories and rewrite his own history as a father. We are talking about a man who stood helplessly by years prior, watching Truly's body shut down from acute kidney failure, a catastrophic medical emergency directly resulting from his own negligence while Christine was out of town. If ever there were a child in the Brown family who possessed a medically documented, historically proven fragility, a child who had literally stared death in the face and required meticulous, unwavering parental vigilance, it was Truly. The trauma of that event should have fundamentally rewired Kody's protective instincts, cementing Truly as the absolute center of his paternal anxiety. Instead, through the relentless, insidious manipulation of Robyn's victimhood narrative, that trauma was entirely erased from the family's operational memory. Robyn engineered a reality where her own children, healthy and shielded behind mansion walls, were somehow granted the status of maximum vulnerability, while the child who had actually fought for her life in an intensive care unit was expected to weather a global pandemic in near total paternal isolation. The sheer, chilling cruelty of this psychological operation is staggering. It demonstrates a level of Machiavellian emotional warfare where biological facts and documented medical histories are casually discarded in favor of whatever narrative secures the most real estate. the most television screen time, and the maximum amount of Kody's financial and emotional resources. As the months bled into years, the glaring disparity between the treatment of Robyn's household and the rest of the family ceased to be a private grievance and metastasized into a sprawling digital rebellion. The older Brown siblings, a fiercely loyal phalanx of young adults who had endured their own unique traumas under the glare of reality television cameras, began to recognize the dark truth hiding behind their father's frantic COVID protocols. They saw the devastating toll Kody's absence was taking on their mothers, but more importantly, they saw the quiet, stoic suffering of Truly, the youngest original sibling who had been arbitrarily exiled from her father's affection. The Flagstaff mansion was no longer a home. It was an occupied territory, and the older siblings became the ultimate whistleblowers. This was not a loud, chaotic confrontation, but a slow, methodical dismantling of Robyn's carefully curated image through the razor-sharp, weaponized irony of social media. Every photograph posted of the massive, joyful gatherings happening without Kody, every subtle, sarcastic comment on a TikTok video, every podcast interview where a sibling casually mentioned the reality of their fractured dynamic. These were devastating artillery strikes against the tender-aged defense. The older siblings recognized that Robyn was holding their father hostage, not with chains, but with manufactured anxiety, and they refused to play along with the delusion. They built an impenetrable wall of solidarity around Truly, elevating her from a forgotten casualty of a failed plural marriage to the absolute focal point of their collective rebellion. They showed the world, and more terrifyingly, they showed the TLC network executives, that the true heart of the Brown family did not reside in the silent, hoarder-filled halls of Robyn's estate, but in the vibrant, interconnected lives of the children who had survived Kody's abandonment. You must look beyond the emotional devastation and examine the ruthless financial and legal maneuvers that the tender-aged excuse was designed to obscure. Reality television is an industry built on access and screen time, translating directly into highly lucrative contracts, brand deals, and centralized wealth. By monopolizing Kody's physical presence under the guise of protecting Solomon and Ariella, Robyn was executing a brilliant, albeit deeply cynical, financial coup. Every day Kody spent locked inside her home was a day the cameras were forced to focus on her narrative, securing her position as the undeniable center of gravity for the entire production. While Christine, Janelle, and Mary were left to film themselves on cell phones or conduct sterile, socially distanced interviews in their backyards, Robyn was directing a multi-camera, high-stakes domestic drama from the comfort of her living room. The tender-aged lie was the legal and financial scaffolding that allowed Kody and Robyn to justify the systemic starvation of the other households. It provided the ultimate cover story for why family funds were being diverted to secure massive plots of land at Coyote Pass, land that would ultimately fall under the centralized control of Kody and Robyn's newly formed, exclusive corporate entities like Dabsark LLC. The tears Robyn shed on the couch, the agonizing monologues Kody delivered to the camera about the unbearable weight of leadership, these were not expressions of genuine parental agony. They were highly produced smokescreens designed to distract the audience while the equity of the original wives was systematically stripped away and funneled into a monogamous empire. They used the manufactured fragility of two children to justify the financial ruin and emotional bankruptcy of an entire extended family. The absolute shattering of Kody's paternal credibility is best viewed through the cinematic, almost grotesque juxtaposition of how he interacted with his children when the cameras were rolling. Picture the agonizing, painfully awkward scene of Kody arriving at Christine's house for a mandated, socially distanced farewell. He stood meters away from Truly, his body language stiff, defensive, and completely devoid of warmth, treating his own flesh and blood like a potential biological hazard. He offered no physical comfort, no reassuring embrace, just a hollow, performative presence that underscored the profound strangers they had become. Now, cut instantly to the footage captured just days later, inside the heavily guarded perimeter of Robyn's property. Watch Kody wrestling in the dirt with Robyn's children, embracing them without a second thought, completely abandoning the draconian, militaristic safety protocols he claimed were an absolute matter of life and death. The pacifier remaining in Ariella's mouth long past a developmentally appropriate age, the absolute lack of rules or boundaries, the relentless coddling, it all stands in violent, sickening contrast to the forced independence and emotional stoicism demanded of Truly. This visual evidence is irrefutable. It bypasses all legal arguments and public relations spin, striking directly at the visceral, instinctive understanding of anyone who has ever been a parent. The audience watches these contrasting scenes and feels a profound, almost physical revulsion. It is the visual documentation of a father who has entirely compartmentalized his empathy, reserving his humanity exclusively for the children who share the roof of his favorite wife. Robyn's catastrophic miscalculation was believing she could orchestrate these optics without the world recognizing the sinister, deeply unequal reality playing out on their screens. The ultimate collapse of Robyn's empire was triggered by the one variable she could neither control nor manipulate: Christine's absolute refusal to allow her daughter's spirit to be broken. When Christine finally packed up her home, effectively taking Truly and walking away from the toxic, suffocating ecosystem of Flagstaff, she did more than end a spiritual marriage. She detonated the entire foundational premise of the tender-aged lie. She took the living, breathing evidence of Kody's hypocrisy and removed her from the battlefield, transporting Truly to a joyful, bustling, emotionally rich life in Utah, surrounded by a massive network of siblings who adored her. The contrast became immediately, blindingly apparent to millions of viewers. On one side of the screen, we see Truly thriving, laughing, engaging in bizarre, wonderful, deeply creative teenage behaviors, fully supported by a mother who celebrates her individuality. On the other side, we are subjected to the dark, paranoid, eternally anxious environment Robyn has curated. A sterile holding pen where her children are kept in a perpetual state of manufactured infancy to satisfy her insatiable need for control. Christine's silent victory was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. She did not scream. She did not demand equal time. She simply removed her child from the equation, leaving Kody and Robyn to drown in the absolute absurdity of their own excuses. With Truly gone, living a vibrant life completely independent of Kody's presence, the narrative that Solomon and Ariella would somehow spontaneously combust without their father's constant supervision collapsed under the weight of its own ridiculousness. Watch the total terrifying unraveling of Kody's psyche in the aftermath of this departure. His explosive anger, the infamous, terrifying rant about a knife to the kidneys, the veins bulging in his neck as he screamed at the women who had subsidized his entire adult life. This was not the righteous anger of a spurned lover. This was the sheer, unadulterated panic of a narcissist who realizes he has completely lost control over the narrative, and more importantly, lost control over the primary subjects of his manipulation. And where was Robyn during this spectacular, deeply unsettling breakdown? She sat entirely silent, her face a mask of practiced, tragic concern, quietly observing her handiwork as the man she had molded into a weapon systematically burned every remaining bridge to his past. She had successfully isolated him from his entire biological legacy, leaving him completely, utterly dependent on her and the artificially extended infancy of her children. But the victory is hollow, and the panic is beginning to set in beneath the surface of Robyn's carefully neutral expressions. Time, the relentless enemy of every elaborate lie, is catching up to the Flagstaff mansion. Solomon and Ariella are aging out of the tender age demographic. The biological clock is ticking loudly, echoing through the empty halls of their hoarder's paradise. The pacifiers must eventually be discarded, the children must eventually enter the world, and the impenetrable shield Robyn used to monopolize Kody's existence is rapidly expiring. As the calendar turns, the terrifying question looming over Robyn's future is this: what happens when the tender-aged excuse entirely evaporates? What happens when Kody, a man pathologically addicted to chaos and the pursuit of new, adoring audiences, realizes he is locked in a massive, financially draining estate with a woman who has systematically alienated him from his entire empire? The older siblings are gone, thriving in their respective lives. their social media feeds a continuous, agonizing reminder of the massive, joyful family Kody willingly threw away. Truly is blossoming into a sharp, articulate young woman who owes Kody absolutely nothing, a walking testament to his failure. Robyn is staring down the barrel of a deeply uncomfortable reality. She built a fortress to keep the sister wives out, but she ultimately built a prison for herself. She is now trapped in a monogamous marriage with an intensely angry, deeply bitter, financially overextended man whose television career is hanging by a thread, reliant entirely on an audience that profoundly despises them. The tender-aged children were the ultimate pawns in a long, dark game of reality television chess. But the game is over. The board has been flipped, and Robyn is left entirely alone to survey the absolute wreckage of her own catastrophic success. The barren, untouched dirt of Coyote Pass stands today as the ultimate, sweeping cinematic metaphor for the absolute devastation wrought by Robyn's manufactured paranoia. The wind howling through those empty pine trees carries the ghost of a plural family utopia that was systematically dismantled, not by financial ruin or outside persecution, but from within the sterile walls of Robyn's meticulously guarded fortress. Imagine the sheer, suffocating claustrophobia of Kody and Robyn standing on that empty plot of land, staring at the muddy, undeveloped acreage that was supposed to house their sprawling dynasty. They are entirely alone. The grand, interconnected mansions Kody once passionately sketched on oversized presentation boards have evaporated, replaced by the crushing, undeniable reality of a deeply isolated monogamous marriage fueled entirely by grievance. The tender-age defense, the very foundation upon which Robyn built her empire of exclusivity, has inevitably collided with the one force she cannot manipulate: time itself. Solomon and Ariella, the supposed fragile centerpieces of this catastrophic family rupture, are rapidly aging out of the protective bubble that justified the destruction of an entire family tree. As they grow taller, as their vocabularies expand, as the pacifiers and the infantilizing baby talk become undeniably grotesque even to the most sympathetic observer, Robyn's impenetrable shield begins to crack. She is forced to confront the horrifying reality that her children can no longer be weaponized as fragile infants, requiring their father's constant, agonizing surveillance. The biological expiration date on her most effective lie has arrived, and beneath the surface of her carefully crafted victimhood, an icy panic is undeniably setting in. Contrast the grim, joyless atmosphere of the Flagstaff hoarder's mansion with the blinding, radiant triumph of Truly Brown's current existence. Truly is the living, breathing antidote to Robyn's toxic ecosystem of perpetual anxiety. As a sharp, internet-savvy, incredibly perceptive teenager, she has weaponized her own happiness to deliver the ultimate, devastating blow to the father who abandoned her. Truly does not cry on camera. She does not beg for Kody's fragmented attention. She does not engage in the exhausting, manipulative, emotional bartering that defines Robyn's daily existence. Instead, she posts wildly creative, vibrantly authentic glimpses into a life overflowing with genuine love, completely unbothered by the gaping void Kody left behind. Every time Truly flashes a sarcastic smile on social media, every time she showcases her unique alternative style, every time she is photographed laughing hysterically surrounded by the massive, impenetrable army of her older siblings, she is driving a final, fatal stake through the heart of the tender-aged narrative. She is proving, with effortless teenage swagger, that the fragility Robyn claimed was an inherent Brown family trait was nothing more than a localized contagion restricted entirely to Robyn's property line. Truly's thriving independence exposes the dark, unspoken truth that Kody did not stay away to protect his family. He stayed away because he was emotionally hollowed out, entirely captured by a woman who required the emotional starvation of others to feel secure in her own supremacy. The ultimate revenge of the discarded child is not anger. It is profound, spectacular indifference. And Truly's indifference is currently suffocating the last remnants of Kody's paternal ego. The absolute masterstroke of this family rebellion lies in the quiet, coordinated solidarity of the original 13 Brown children. a sprawling syndicate of siblings who have collectively decided to rewrite the narrative of their own lives. They watched with clear, traumatized eyes as their mothers were financially bled dry and emotionally discarded to fund the opulent, isolated lifestyle of a woman who viewed them not as family, but as biological inconveniences. Now, as independent adults free from the oppressive, camera-ready demands of their father's manufactured patriarchy, they have built a fortress of their own, and Truly is stationed safely in the center. Picture the sprawling, chaotic, impossibly joyful holiday gatherings orchestrated by Christine and Janelle, documented vividly across social media platforms for the entire world to see. Tables groaning under the weight of massive feasts, rooms echoing with explosive laughter, dozens of interconnected family members celebrating their survival and their unbreakable bond. Then, cut the camera back to Flagstaff. Picture the suffocating, silent dread of Kody and Robyn's holidays, a deeply tragic, entirely isolated affair, confined to a house overflowing with expensive, meaningless trinkets, but completely devoid of warmth. Kody is forced to sit in his leather chair, surrounded by the spoils of his emotional theft, watching through the agonizing lens of his smartphone as his entire biological legacy celebrates his absence. The older siblings do not need to issue public statements or engage in bitter television tell-alls. Their mere joyous existence is the most devastating indictment of Robyn's character ever produced. They have effectively quarantined Kody and Robyn inside their own deception, leaving them to marinate in the toxic, claustrophobic reality they destroyed an entire family to achieve. As the cultural tide entirely turns against them, the financial walls of the Flagstaff mansion are beginning to violently close in. The tender-aged excuse was not just a shield against paternal responsibility. It was the highly lucrative engine of a television machine that demanded constant, gripping conflict. For years, the TLC network capitalized on the agonizing, slow-motion car crash of Kody's marriages dissolving, using Robyn's tears and Kody's explosive anger as the premium fuel for a ratings juggernaut. But audiences are fiercely intelligent, and their tolerance for unrepentant cruelty is ultimately finite. The exposure of the tender-aged lie has fundamentally shifted the viewing public's relationship with Kody and Robyn from frustrated fascination to absolute, visceral revulsion. They are no longer viewed as deeply flawed people struggling within a complex religious framework. They are now overwhelmingly recognized as calculated emotional predators. Network executives whose only true religion is audience retention and advertising revenue are watching the digital backlash with terrifying clarity. How do you construct a sympathetic storyline for a man who refuses to see his brilliantly resilient teenage daughter, while simultaneously demanding absolute obedience from the women he drove into poverty? You cannot. The central conflict of the show has entirely evaporated, replaced by a grim, deeply uncomfortable portrait of an isolated, bitter couple hoarding land they cannot afford to develop. Without the financial subsidies historically provided by the discarded wives, and with their television relevance plummeting toward cancellation, Kody and Robyn are staring into a terrifying financial abyss. The heavily mortgaged mansion, the piles of garish art, the endless accumulation of depreciating assets. It is all a house of cards waiting for the final, inevitable gust of wind. In the suffocating quiet of their newfound monogamy, the most terrifying threat to Robyn's survival is no longer Christine, Janelle, or Mary. The ultimate threat is sitting right across from her in the living room. Kody Brown is a man pathologically incapable of shouldering the blame for his own failures. For over a decade, he used his plural wives as a series of emotional lightning rods, redirecting his own profound insecurities and catastrophic misjudgments onto the women who tirelessly propped him up. Whenever the pressure became too great, he could simply pack his bags and escape to another house, resetting his reality and leaving someone else to clean up the psychological wreckage. But those escape routes have been permanently sealed. The lightning rods have packed up and moved to Utah. Kody is now entirely trapped in a closed loop of his own devastating consequences, and the simmering, volcanic rage that once targeted Christine and Janelle has nowhere left to go but inward. He is waking up to the horrifying realization that he sacrificed the respect of his older children, the loyalty of his original wives, and the admiration of millions of viewers, all to secure a woman whose endless demands for protection ultimately destroyed his life. As the TLC cameras threaten to pack up and leave for good, as the bank accounts slowly drain, and as the tender-aged children grow into teenagers who cannot be used to justify his cowardice, Kody's legendary wrath will inevitably turn toward the architect of his isolation. The gilded cage Robyn spent a decade meticulously constructing has officially locked from the outside, and she is now trapped inside with a deeply wounded, intensely angry narcissist who is rapidly running out of people to blame. This is the chilling, ultimate legacy of Robyn Brown. She did not enter a plural family to share a husband. She entered a sprawling, vulnerable ecosystem to execute a hostile takeover. She weaponized the sacred concept of motherhood, twisting the natural, biological impulse to protect one's young into a jagged, psychological blade used to sever Kody from his entire past. The tender-aged lie was her masterpiece, a brilliant, terrifyingly effective manipulation that allowed her to steal the crown while convincing the king he was merely building a fortress. But in her relentless pursuit of absolute control, she fundamentally misunderstood the resilience of the children she sought to erase. She thought Truly would quietly fade into the background, a silent casualty of pandemic protocols and shifting paternal priorities. Instead, Truly stepped into the light, completely unburdened by the toxic demands of the Flagstaff mansion, exposing the staggering hypocrisy of Robyn's existence without uttering a single bitter word. Robyn won the battle. She possesses the legal marriage certificate. She occupies the primary real estate. She has Kody's undivided, agonizing attention entirely to herself. But as she looks out over the barren mud of Coyote Pass, listening to the deafening silence of a family that has completely moved on without her, the true horror of her victory comes into razor-sharp focus. She engineered her own absolute isolation, successfully extinguishing every spark of joy, chaos, and love that made the Brown family a television phenomenon. She is the undisputed queen of an empty, rotting kingdom, forever haunted by the vibrant, independent laughter of the teenage girl who proved that the greatest revenge of all is simply surviving the lie. If this deep dive into the darkest, most carefully concealed psychological warfare of reality television left you absolutely speechless, you cannot afford to miss what we are exposing next. The networks spend millions of dollars editing these narratives to protect their most profitable villains. But the truth always leaves a digital footprint, and we are tracking down every single one of them. We rely entirely on viewers like you to help us tear down the facades of these sprawling reality TV empires. Do not let these calculated manipulators control the narrative for another second. Hit that subscribe button right now, smash the like button to push this truth through the algorithm, and fiercely ring that notification bell so you are the very first to know when we drop our next massive investigation. Drop a comment below and tell me exactly what you think Robyn's breaking point will be when the TLC cameras finally stop rolling. The illusions are shattered, the secrets are out, and we are just getting started. This is Jenny Exposes, and the truth is never, ever pretty.